Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to the History Squad. Now, this video is all about the Peasants Revolt in England. It took place in the summer of 1381, but it begs the question, what led to massive peasant armies attacking London, burning, destroying buildings, and then murdering some of the most important people in the land? So let's delve in. Let's have a look. The Peasants Revolt. So peasant armies fell on London during the Feast of Corpus Christi, June 1381. But you've got to look back for the root cause of this. Go back to 1348, to the bubonic plague, the Black Death, where they say 50%, anything up to 50% of the population of England died. That's half your workforce, isn't it? So when everything was recovering, your labour force could command higher wages, and that was the problem. As soon as the labourers are claiming higher wages, the profits of the landowners, the employers, they go down. That in turn affects trade, which then affects investments, financial institutions, which began to fall apart. So the authorities brought in emergency legislation. There was the Ordinance of Labour, 1349, then the Statute of Labour, 1351. Now, this was an attempt to fix wages at the pre-plague levels. Now, if you went against your master, if you refused to work for him or you broke contract, you could be put in front of the manorial courts, which were, of course, run by your landowner, and fined. But they brought in extra legislation in 1361, and that brought in more punishments. You could be imprisoned or you could be branded. Let me explain about the lower order, the common people at that time. If you were a serf, you're at the bottom of the pile. You're in bondage to your master, and that means that you were tied to a parcel of land owned by your master, by your lord, and you had to farm that land on his behalf. He couldn't sell you as a slave, but he could sell the parcel of land, and because you're tied with it, you're sold alongside it. As a serf, you were required to work that land for the Lord, but you could also be required to do other work. Work at the house, the big manor house. What if you had a mine or a quarry? You can end up down there. You even had to get permission from your noble lord to get married. In return, your noble lord, he would protect you. But I'm telling you now, there were many noble lords who extorted every last penny out of their serfs. They squeezed them dry. One interesting saying was the serf and the freeman worked for all, and the nobleman fought for all, and the churchman prayed for all. In fact, the serf was the worst fed and the worst rewarded. Now, one up from the serf is the freeman. He's basically a tenanted farmer. He pays rent for the land he's going to work. If he decided he wanted to move, he's not tied to the land or to that particular lord of the manor, as it were. He could move, maybe, for better wages or better conditions. Now, your artisans were your skilled workers, like your carpenter, stonemason, or your blacksmith. Now, you may have an established business in a town, or you may be an itinerant worker. You're working along, and you're flexible then because you could seek out better wages, or you could even charge more for your services. But of course, this had become illegal, charging more for your services, and you could end up being branded on the face. Now, there was a problem. After that Black Death, as I've mentioned, there were a shortage of labourers and craftsmen. So noble lords who wanted a good carpenter would offer better wages, so he'd come and work for him. And if he was low on serfs' labour, he would actually entice serfs' freemen to come and work for him off other estates. Now, of course, this was illegal, but it did go on. So slowly but surely, the common man was doing better for himself. Better wages, so better accommodation, good food, and better clothing. And the upper class, the noblemen, thought that the lower classes were getting a bit above themselves, so they had the sumptuary laws passed, which controlled what you ate. It meant that the common man was supposed to stay with common food and to dress like a common man. Now, these sumptuary laws were difficult to apply, to keep in order. However, the labour laws, they were strictly applied, and if you broke them, you could end up in court you could end up being fined or even end up in prison. It was a way of keeping the common man down. So when it comes to the lower orders paying tax, they didn't pay tax with cash directly to their noble lord or to the crown. What happened was this: you are farming that strip of land, you make produce for yourself. Now 1/3 of that produce, let's say you've got 3 sacks of wheat at the end of it all, your noble lord will then choose the best quality of those 3 sacks of wheat. He in turn then will pay tax to the crown, which will represent how many workers he has. So he is either using or selling that wheat to make a profit, and he will pay the tax from that. Now, the problem at this particular time was the wars in France were raging. We now call them the 100 Years' War. If you take an army at the time, they would burn up £50,000 just on 6 months' service. Just before King Edward III passed away, there was a new tax brought in, 1377. This was the first poll tax. It meant that every person over the age of 14 will pay 4p towards this tax. There was even an allowance for the married man. He didn't have to pay quite so much. But the burden of this tax fell heavily on the shoulders of the landowners. Now, this first tax produced £22,000. Now, the shortfall for the whole bill of this army in France fell on the merchants of the City of London in the form of enforced loans. But it still didn't meet requirements. There still wasn't enough money, and the reason was quite straightforward. It is believed that much of the money was actually filtered away into the private coffers of some of the king's councillors. Now, after the death of Edward III, it was his grandson who came to the throne, Richard II. The problem was he was only 10 years of age, so his government was formed around his uncles, but the most prominent of those was John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. He was said to be the richest man in England. Oh, he was so disliked. He could not resist trampling over those people beneath him. He particularly hated the merchants of London. He was not a nice man. In 1379, there was a second poll tax was brought in, but it was on a sliding scale. The more money or land you owned, the more you paid until you get all the way down. Now, £60,000 was expected to be raised towards this war in France, but only £18,600 was collected. People were dodging the tax. Now, in November 1380, Parliament was called, but the weather was so bad, many of the members of Parliament couldn't actually get to London. So the Parliament was held in Northampton. And the Lord Chancellor there, Archbishop Simon Sudbury, now there's a name, he announced that the government required £160,000 for the wars in France. This is 8 times the amount of the sum collected in 1379. And the Parliament, they rebelled against it. They said it would actually bankrupt many of the people of England. So it was reduced to £100,000. And 1/3 of this was to be paid for by the clergy. But the 2/3 that were to be collected from the commons was to be collected straight away. If all went according to plan, England would be safe and secure. And of course, they'd found a new lucrative form of income by tapping into the wealth of the lower orders of England. So a third poll tax was raised. Every person over 15 years of age had to pay 12p, and there was no allowance for marriage. It was highly unpopular, and many refused to register for the poll tax, especially down in the southeast. So March 1381, there was a royal commission, and the commissioners were sent out into the shires to question the town officials. Who's not paying? Why are they not paying? Now, if all of this money had been raised, only half of it was destined for the army. The other half was actually going to be used from an expedition of John of Gaunt. He was misappropriating funds for his own use. His expedition was to go into Portugal for his own ends. And this is the wealthiest man in England. A new treasurer had been appointed to oversee the collection of the third poll tax. This was Sir Robert Hales. He was the owner of several fine estates in Essex and Hertfordshire. Now, over the month of February, he reviewed the tax receipts, and they were riddled with obvious evasions. You see, in 1377 in Essex, the taxable population had been 48,000, but now in 1381 there were just 30,748 people there. Even allowing for the Black Death, this didn't add up. People were not registering, they were avoiding to pay the tax. So now you had royal inquisitors interrogating people as to their eligibility to pay the poll tax. Now they were commanded to arrest and detain anybody who was against the poll tax, who refused to pay. They were basically royal thugs. Word spread actually about an incident in Fobbing, in the village of Fobbing in Essex, where one of these inquisitors was lifting the skirts of young girls to test and see if they had actually enjoyed intercourse with a man, which would have made them eligible to pay the poll tax. This is not a test that any decent parent would want their daughter to go through, so many would simply pay the tax to protect their young ladies. So the dates for the payment of the 2/3, the 66,666, have been brought forward from the 2nd of June to the 21st of April. The pressure was on to gather the poll tax, but because of the aggression and the contempt that was shown towards the people of the southeast of England, people began to conceive a plan to resist the poll tax. This had been simmering in Essex for some time, but people of Kent were also sick to death, and they were fomenting the idea of rebellion. Resistance to the third poll tax first breaks out when John Bampton, Member of Parliament, Justice of the Peace, arrives in Essex on the 30th of May and sets up his headquarters in Brentwood, and he calls forward for representatives of various villages and demands that they make good the shortfalls to the poll tax. They have 2 days to do it. Well, one man steps forward because these representatives were well armed with bows and sticks. Thomas Baker tells Bampton that we have already paid our tax money. You're getting no more from us. So Bampton then orders his sergeant to arrest Thomas Baker. But now violence breaks out. 3 clerks and several of the jurors who were there were actually killed in the scuffle. The next day news had spread, and in no time at all there were several thousand Essex rebels were marching on London. Meanwhile, men were sent to Kent to inform them of what had been going on, but then some were sent north into Suffolk to try and raise support for the rebellion. Meanwhile, in Kent, Simon de Burley, a nobleman, had accused Robert Belling of being a serf and absconding from his land. Money was paid or was offered to Simon de Burley to drop the charges, but he refused and had his sergeants arrest Robert Belling. He was thrown into Rochester jail, which was in Rochester Castle. Very soon, though, a large mob of locals had heard about this, and they were actually surrounding the castle and causing quite a ruckus. So much so that the constable of the castle surrendered the castle and freed Belling. Now it was at this moment that there was a new character coming on, a leader of the Kentish rebels. His name was Wat Tyler. He was really quite a charismatic individual, but he was very capable of organising his men. It was believed that it was Wat Tyler who was responsible for shaping the political aims of the rebellion. Now, he, together with his rebels, marched down onto Canterbury, which they captured on the 10th of June. They deposed the absent Archbishop Sudbury. But then they went from house to house. They were searching for enemies, and any enemies of their rebellion they found, they dragged out onto the streets and executed. They were butchered, no doubt about it. But then he had the prisons opened and prisoners flooded out. Now they then marched on London, and it would appear that the Kentish rebel march was coordinated both with the Essex march and those coming down from Norfolk and Suffolk. Interestingly, on their way, if they came to a priory or an official residence, it would be searched for documents. And what they were looking for were the parchments with the green seal. This showed that it was a royal document or a financial document. Anything like that they found, they immediately put it onto a bonfire and it was burnt, destroyed. The Kentish rebels arrived just outside of London at Blackheath on the 12th of June. Now, the young king heard about the rebellion and made his way from Windsor along the River Thames, on a boat obviously, to the Tower of London, where he would be safe. He would go there with his mother, the Archbishop Sudbury, Sir Robert Hales, the Earls of Warwick, Salisbury and Arundel. Now, the Bishop of Rochester was actually sent out to meet the rebels and ask what are their demands and then tell them to simply go home. Now, meanwhile, John of Gaunt was not around. He was up on the borders of Scotland trying to arrange a truce between the English and the Scots, so he was nowhere on the scene. At Blackheath, John Ball, a well-known priest and radical preacher, gave a sermon to the gathered Kentish men, but then he asked them, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then a gentleman? He also coined the phrase, with King Richard and the true commons of England. You see, their message was they were to remain loyal to King Richard, but not to the king's advisors. And they told the Bishop of Rochester those very things, and they also added, and we ain't going home. By now, the Essex companies were camped in the fields just outside of Mile End, just to the north of the Tower of London. Now, Bishop Sudbury had actually resigned his great seal, the symbol of him as Chancellor. He had fled for his life from Lambeth Palace. Now he's with the king. The king has decided that they will row up the Thames to Blackheath in 4 barges with his court to try and negotiate with the Kentish rebels. When they arrived, Bishop Sudbury is absolutely terrified. He can see just how vast this army of rebels is, and his fear infected the others, and they persuaded the king not to land. They feared for their lives, but the king agreed to receive a petition from the Kentish rebels. The petition wasn't subtle. It didn't demand justice and redress. It demanded heads on spikes. It demanded the death of those around the king accused of perverting the realm. These was John of Gaunt, Sudbury, Hales and many others. The king and the courtiers were actually stunned, but the king was still willing to negotiate with the rebels. However, he was overruled and the barges turned and rowed away, leaving the message with the rebels that if they wanted to continue with further negotiations, to come to Windsor the following Monday. The rebels were livid. They were absolutely furious. Now they will march on London. The problem they have is getting over London Bridge, because at the southern end of London Bridge there is a great drawbridge which was raised against them. As the Kentish rebels make their way along the south bank of the River Thames, passing through Southwark, they are told by local Londoners of a house that belongs to the Mayor of London, William Walworth. It is rented from him and has been used as a brothel. The rebels now fall upon the house, pull it down and set it on fire, terrifying the Flemish prostitutes who were within. They then make their way to the southern part of the London Bridge, and there is a standoff. The drawbridge is raised, don't forget. But people inside London are now on London Bridge, and they persuade the constable of the bridge to lower the drawbridge, and the Kentish rebels stream across London Bridge. Meanwhile, local Londoners have gone to the other side of London to open the gates to allow the Essex rebels into London. Now, the local Londoners are going to act as guides, and they want the rebels to go to the Savoy Palace, that great palace built by the family of the richest man in England, John of Gaunt. But Wat Tyler makes his way first to Fleet Prison. he releases everybody in the prison, all of the prisoners. Many of them are debtors. This will swell his ranks. So now you have the Kentish rebels, you've got the Essex rebels, Norfolk and Suffolk apparently had sent men down, but the locals as well in London, artisans, bakers, carpenters, apprentices. There was even a Faulkner now working with the rebels of Kent and Essex. The rebels had lots of targets in London, particularly houses or property owned by John of Gaunt or those associated with him. But one way they actually destroyed these houses was they took the tiles off the roof and then set fire to what was inside the house. This would create a kind of a chimney effect, so the blaze would really go some. But one of their main targets was the New Temple. This was the spiritual home of the legal profession in London. It was crammed full of documents and charters. The rebels really despised all of this business of the legal profession. Now, the New Temple covered between 6 and 7 acres. There were lots of buildings there. Every one of them was set on fire and fetched down. But they had, these rebels, a particular venom for the lawyers, as much as they did for the politicians. They even broke into the Round Church where William Marshall was buried, and they there took all of the documents out, especially those with the green seal, set them all on fire. And they were absolutely happy watching all of these documents burn. You see, this was a calculated attack on the legal profession. It wasn't mindless vandalism. They were destroying the documents showing how the ordinary people of England were kept in check. On the way to the Savoy Palace, the home of John of Gaunt, the rebels burnt many houses and much property that belonged to either John of Gaunt or people associated with him. In fact, anybody associated with John of Gaunt in the city was in danger of their life. But when the rebels arrived and saw this great Savoy Palace, many of them had never seen such a building, and it absolutely blew their minds. Do you know that palace cost £35,000 to build? This was the same cost of an English army in France for about 3 or 4 months. It's incredible. Anyway, the Londoners had beat the rebels to it, and they'd already set fire to the palace. But some of the rebels, about 30 men I understand, found their way into the wine cellars, and they were having a great time, a great party. Meanwhile, upstairs, 3 barrels had been found, and they were believed to contain silver or gold. Now, the rebels weren't looting at this stage, so they decided to destroy these riches by throwing them onto the fire. Unfortunately, they didn't contain gold or silver. They contained gunpowder. Shortly afterwards, there was an enormous explosion, bringing down part of the building on top of the wine cellar, sealing the men in. Nobody knew they were there. Nobody could hear their cries for help. It would actually take a few days for these men to finally die. An awful way to go, don't you think? After the destruction of the Savoy Palace, the rebels broke up into smaller groups so they could search out their enemies, one of whom was Roger Leggatt. He was a lawyer and a rogue. He'd amassed quite a collection of properties around the city of London, and he was discovered clinging to a post in the church of Martin le Grand. He was dragged out screaming, dragged along the streets to Cheapside, where just opposite Eleanor's Cross his head was hacked off. It would be one of 18 heads that would roll that night. Many buildings were razed to the ground that evening. A good number of them belonged to Sir Robert Hales, who was actually inside the tower with the king being 14 years of age. Just remember that. Now, surrounding them was their tower guard, 1,200 men. But the king was getting fed up with the indecision of his council. So he took matters into his own hands. Now, don't forget, I've already said 14 years of age. So he writes out a bill. He orders 2 knights to take this to the rebels and read it out. And it went something like this. It grants full pardons for all manner of trespass, misimprisonments, and felonies done up to this hour. And it willed and commanded that all should return to their homes. Everyone should put their grievances in writing and send them to the king. This was a polite fob off, and I will be honest with you, even reading about it all these hundreds of years later, it did not impress the rebels. They didn't go home. On Friday the 14th of June, the rebellion had spread to St Albans, but at the break of dawn, just outside the Tower of London, the rebels were feasting themselves on the victuals and drinks that they'd intercepted. These were supposed to be going in for the king. Meanwhile, the king inside the tower is still having problems with his councillors. They are undecided. They're split as to what to do. Some have said, attack the rebels now, they're drunk. But the king decided instead that he would meet the rebels face to face out at Mile End. So messages were sent to the rebels, and he assembled a large party of knights and his nobles, leaving behind those nobles that he thought were liable to be assassinated. At Mile End, the rebels assembled in front of the king presented him with a charter of justice. These were their demands. I'm going to read them out to you. They asked that all men of England be made free forever, their lands and their heirs, that all future generations be free from servitude. They asked especially for 4p an acre on land rent. That's an interesting one. End of cash payments through rents, feudal fines through the courts and tax system. Finally, asked that no man should be compelled to work except by employment. You know, it didn't matter what the rebels demanded from the king. He wasn't there as negotiator. He was there as a lure to draw the rebels out of London. He guarantees their freedom, but then he makes a blunder. He goes a little bit further because he says, I will guarantee your freedom and all of that kind of stuff by charter. He says, and what's more, you are free to go across the realm of England and capture the enemies of the state and bring them before me, before the courts of law, where they will be tried and punished accordingly. It was a big mistake, because now he had given the rebels the power to pursue their enemies and bring them to justice. What's more, it was going to be issued on the king's charter. Big mistake. Word quickly spread amongst the crowd there that the king had sanctioned the capture of rebel enemies. So companies detached themselves from the crowd and made their way back to the Tower of London, where some of the worst traitors actually hid. Now the guards in the tower, on hearing what the king had said, weren't sure what to do, so eventually they let the rebels in. Fortunately, the Queen Mother, together with her ladies of the court, had been smuggled out of the tower and they escaped down the River Thames on barges. But others weren't quite so lucky. Hales and John Legg were captured. Henry of Derby was hidden by one of the guards. Now this is how history works. He was safe. He would become Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV, one of those quirks of history. Now Archbishop Sudbury, he was found in the chapel and he was dragged out together with the others across the courtyards up to Tower Hill, where they were executed. Their heads were then placed on poles. Now, a later account of the Archbishop Sudbury's execution, it states that it took 8 blows from a sword to actually cut his head off. And during the proceedings, he raised his hand and some of his fingers had been cut off. Now, Archbishop Sudbury's head was buried at his parish church in Sudbury in Suffolk. But his body's buried at Canterbury Cathedral. But because it didn't have a head, they put a cannonball in place of his head. And I've got to be honest, all these quirks of history, I really find that quite amusing. After King Richard's proclamation, it would seem that at least half of the rebels were quite happy with what the king had said, and they simply returned home. But in London itself, discipline was breaking down, and the gangs were breaking up and pursuing their own vendettas against their enemies. One of the main groups of enemies were called the Flemings. These were responsible for cross-channel trade, and they were also had a lot of royal favour. And they ran, so it was said, all of the brothels in London. Now, they took refuge in St Martin in the Vintry, a church in London, but they were caught, dragged outside and massacred by having their heads chopped off. Other casualties included Sir Richard Lyons. He was a fantastically rich London merchant. Then Sir John Cavendish, he was the senior judge in England. Then there was a notorious jailer, Richard Imworth. He was a brute. Then the physician to John of Gaunt, William Appleton. He was one of those who was rounded up. And all of these men lost their lives at the hands of the rebels. Finally, the young king begins to listen to the advice of the Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth. Walworth reckons that he can raise enough troops to take on the rebels. So, the king agrees to meet the rebels out at Smithfield. So he's surrounded by 200 retainers facing several thousand of the rebels. When he arrives there, Wat Tyler rides out to meet the king. There is a conversation, and apparently the king tells Wat Tyler that they can have whatever the king can fairly grant. But then his voice changes, and he tells Wat Tyler in a sharp voice, "Now, go home." Tyler and the king stood there face to face, both uncertain of what to do next. There was silence for a while. Then Wat Tyler demands a jug of water. One is produced, he takes a swig of it, swirls it round his mouth, and spits it out onto the ground in front of the king. This was regarded as an act of vulgarity by Tyler before his king. But what happened next happened so quick. A cry came out from one of the courtiers. Whatever was said, we don't know, but it rankled Wat Tyler. It was a setup, or was it? Whatever it was, Tyler took the bait. He gripped his dagger and responded to whoever had cried out that he would lose his head. This was the very moment that Walworth was waiting for. Wat Tyler now is waving his dagger about. Walworth rides forward. "I am arresting you for contemptible behaviour in front of your king." But as he makes a grab for Wat Tyler, Tyler thrusts his dagger straight into the Lord Mayor. But he was wearing armour underneath his clothes. The dagger simply bounces off. Walworth then draws his own dagger and plunges it straight into the neck of Wat Tyler. He draws it back out and then stabs Tyler straight into their head. At that very moment, Sir Ralph Standish breaks ranks, charges into the two men and runs Wat Tyler through with his sword. Confusion now reigns. Everything happened so quickly. They saw Wat Tyler fall to the ground. And at that moment, that young King Richard bravely rides past the fallen body of Tyler. The rebels truly had been wrong-footed. They didn't quite know what to do. But the king rides towards them. They lower their weapons. The king then bids them to follow him, and he leads them out of Smithfield onto the fields beyond. Walworth now rode back to Smithfield, and he tracked down Wat Tyler. He was still alive, so Walworth hacked off his head. He then gathered his hastily assembled citizen army, and they returned to Clerkenwell Fields, holding up the severed head of Wat Tyler. When the rebels saw it, their will to fight drained away, and don't forget they were now surrounded by armed men. Beaten in arms and broken in spirit, the rebels dropped to their knees, and they cried out to their king for mercy, and "Please let us go home." So the king, he set off 2 knights to escort the rebels away from London. They could go home. What the king had done, in fact, he had sent them packing. But the rebellion didn't stop with the death of Wat Tyler. It spread throughout the shires to as far north as York. But eventually, the rebellion was crushed. The ringleaders were arrested and put to death. They were hanged, drawn and quartered. And anything up to 1,500 of the rebels were also put to death. But these men had been rounded up by the king's commissioners, often without trial and without burden of proof, before they were put to death. Those common men, all they were doing was fighting for the right for freedom. Well, Richard II, our young king, he'd won a great victory for sure, but he'd learned one thing: you can't push your people too far. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, like, share and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel further, why not have a look at joining in with our Patreon community? The link is in the description. Now, before I go, quick shout out to some of our Patreon members, and I've got it written down here so I don't forget names. So, thanks, Jake Pearson, Cindy Stott and Tom G. Hey guys, thanks a million. Bye for now.